In this lesson, we're going to begin to discuss formatting type. If you'd like to follow along, go under the File menu to Open, and in the Sample Files folder, scroll down to 0601-0602 Character Formatting and just click Open. Before we start doing anything, I want you to make sure that in the workspace pop-up, you're using the typography preset. If you're not, please choose it. If you open your character panel and it looks like this, where not all of the options are showing, go under that pop-up menu, the options menu of the character panel. It's that down-turned arrow, and go to the very first listing, which is Show Options. Also, in the control panel, to the far left of the control panel, you'll see that there's a button that should be highlighted that says Character Formatting Controls. If instead Paragraph Formatting Controls is highlighted, click on the A, which is the character formatting, to show all of the right settings. The same settings are shown in both the control panel and the character panel. They may be in different places, however. Before we begin, let's scroll up in our document to the very top and select the second line of text, which is a paragraph that I want to make into a subhead. To make it a subhead, I first want to change the type family. I have a lot of type on my computer. I mean, if I click down on the little pop-up menu that is right immediately to the right of the type family field, you're going to see that there's a lot of different fonts here. At the very top of that pop-up menu are the fonts that I've used most recently. And then it starts alphabetically at the A's and continues, and I have a lot of fonts, like I said. You'll see to the right of each font family name a preview of what that family looks like. To the left, you'll see one of three different letters. There's a TT combination, which is true type. Someplace in my menu is a lowercase red a. That is Adobe PostScript Type 1, which is the original PostScript type format that was introduced way back in 1984. And then there should be a lot of type that has a slanted black O. That's open type, which is a new type format that was introduced when InDesign was first introduced about 12 years ago. We'll be talking a lot more about these different type formats in an upcoming lesson. With so many fonts available on my computer, is there a fast way to find exactly the font that I may want to apply? Well, let me get out of this menu and go back to that type family field. Let's say I wanted to apply Myriad Pro. Well, what I could do is start typing Myriad, M-Y, and it went right there. By typing the first 2 or 3 characters, I can go right to the type family that I may want to use. And then all I have to do is hit Enter or Return. And now it is Myriad Pro Regular. Well, if it's a subhead, I don't want to use regular. I want to make it bold. Well, I wonder if I could do the same thing here. Sometimes it's going to work exactly the way you want. Other times it won't. I'm going to type a B for bold. And it went to bold condense. Now, if I didn't want to use bold condensed, I may have to continue typing or just go under the pop-up. The style names are not as many as the family names in the pop-up menu. So I'm just going to go to bold. And now I have Myriad Pro bold. The next field has something to do with the point size. I can tell that from the icon because it has a little tiny grayed out T and then a big T. So it has to do with the point size of the type. Right now it's 12 point. I could click my up arrow to make it bigger 1 point at a time, or I could even go under the pop-up menu immediately to the right of the field and choose some other point size. Well, that's a little bigger than I was planning, so let me go back down. And if this is supposed to be a headline, my first line, Let me make that bigger. I'm just going to start clicking my up arrow until it's as big as I want. That's better. Let me go back to my subhead and select that. With 16-point type, it's telling me that my leading is 19.2 point type. Well, I wonder what that's about. It's in parentheses. By default, InDesign uses something called auto leading. That means that the leading is slightly greater than the point size. But what is leading? It's a measurement between the baseline of a particular line of type and the baseline of the line of type above. So by measuring from baseline to baseline, it's actually controlling the distance between the lines of type. What is this auto leading? Well, why don't we select our body copy, the first paragraph of body text. Instead of 12-point type, I'm going to make it 10-point type. And you can see with 10-point type, the leading is 12 points. If it's using auto leading, you can see auto is checked in the pop-up menu immediately to the right of the leading field. But how much is it? Auto leading is 1.2 times whatever the point size is for your selected type. And I can tell it's auto leading because it's in parentheses. If I were to increase this, the leading remains 1.2 times whatever the point size is. So a little bit more leading makes the type more readable. But what is the next field? It shows characters being spaced in the little icon. There's an A next to a V and spaces being taken out. It uses something called metrics. And kerning, what it's actually doing automatically is making the spacing between the characters equal. So it's even spacing for the lettering. Metrics are actually part of the typefaces that you're using. It's kind of like a little chart inside of the typeface. And what it's doing is saying, if I have a lowercase a next to a lowercase a, it's going to be this amount of space. If it's a lowercase a next to a lowercase b, it's going to be this amount of space. And if it's a lowercase a next to a lowercase c, it's going to be this amount of space. What it's doing is running through all the possible combinations of characters and assigning a certain amount of space for that particular combination. So all of the spacing is equal. Metrics were introduced when the very first PostScript type was introduced in 1984 by Adobe. And they work really well, except when they don't. When do they not work? Numbers do not have metrics. The reason they don't have metrics is so that numbers all take up the same amount of space as each other, so numbers will line up perfectly in columns. So narrow numbers, like a number 1, have the same amount of space as a 9 or a 0. It always looks like the number 1 has too much space around it. If you look at the type that I have selected here, that first number, 1567, you can see that it looks like there's an extraordinary amount of space to the left of that number 1. It's a lot more than the space between any of the other words in that particular paragraph. And that's because the number 1 takes up the same amount of space as a number 9 or a 0 or any other number, so that they line up perfectly in columns. Okay, so that's a problem with metrics when you have numbers in running body text. There are other problems as well. Like, for instance, if I were to take a letter, how about I select a couple of paragraphs down, I select that capital M at the beginning of that particular paragraph, and I just make it bigger. I'm going to click my up arrow. There's no longer any metrics between the M and the O. Let me zoom in a lot closer. You can see there's an incredible amount of space between that M and the O. So that's another problem. If you have different size characters that are next to each other, or if they're using different styles or they're completely different type families, there are no metrics, so it does nothing. It doesn't close up the space between the M and the O, so it looks humongous, like you can drive a truck through there. There has to be another way to space your type. I'm going to select this entire paragraph. by clicking 4 times. I'm going to go to where it says metrics, and I'm going to choose instead, by clicking on the pop-up menu immediately to the right of metrics, I'm going to choose optical. And you can see it fixed the problem. But what is it doing? Well, the reason it's called optical is it's spacing the type exactly the same way that you would by eye. Optical actually compares the relative shapes and sizes of the characters and spaces the type accordingly so it looks equal. It's making the negative space between the characters equal. So it's really a totally different way to make your spacing of your characters equal. I use optical almost all the time. The only times that I don't, when I'm trying to line up numbers in columns. If I were to use optical, the spacing would be beautiful, but the numbers would not line up in columns. So I have to use metrics so that all numbers use the same amount of space so they line up perfectly down the column. Another time I wouldn't use optical, there are certain script typefaces that have connecting parts between the characters that connect from one character to another. And if I were to use optical with those particular script typefaces, the spacing between the characters would be absolutely beautiful, but those connecting parts of the characters would not connect properly, so I have to use metrics. There's something else that I just noticed. You see with the TT, the field immediately to the right of the point size is empty. Why is that field empty? It's because the M and all the rest of the characters in that particular paragraph are not the same. If they're not the same, InDesign will put nothing in that field. How can I get it back to the same setting for everything? Well, I'm just going to type a 12 in the point size field and then press enter or return. And you can see now it is filled in and all of the type is using exactly the same size. In the next lesson, we're going to continue to discuss character panel formatting.